Welcome, aspirants. I know that constitutional history can feel like a real maze of acts and dates, but it's a super critical topic for the BPSC and UPSC exams. So in this rapid revision explainer, we're going to connect all the dots between the key laws that literally shaped modern India. And you want to stick around, because at the end, we're going to hit some real exam questions to make sure these concepts are totally locked in.
So, take a look at this. This is a classic question, the kind you'll definitely see. Now, if the answer doesn't immediately jump out at you, hey, don't worry about it. By the time we're done here, you'll know exactly how to break this down and answer it with total confidence. All right, let's kick things off right at the beginning, the era of company rule. You have to remember, for a long, long time, the East India Company was basically a private corporation running wild. By the 1770s, things were a mess. It was facing bankruptcy, and there were huge accusations of corruption. This really forced the British government's hand, and they had to step in and start regulating it.
Think of this timeline as our roadmap for the first part of our journey. It lays out the 5 big legislative milestones that really define the company's rule, starting with that very first attempt at regulation and ending right before the Crown took over everything. Okay, the Regulating Act of 1773. This was a huge deal. Why? Because it was the British government's first real step to get control over the East India Company. It centralized power by making the governor of Bengal the governor general, and it set up a Supreme Court in Kolkata. And hey, just like that, you've got the answer to that opening question we just looked at. So the 1773 Act was just the start. Fast forward 11 years, and you get Pitt's India Act, which tightened the government's grip even more, with this really clever system they called dual control. So what on earth did this dual system actually look like?
Here's the breakdown. The company, through its court of directors, got to keep managing its commercial business, the trade. But all the political, military, and financial power was now overseen by a new government body back in London called the Board of Control. The bottom line, the government was now calling the real shots. And you can see it right here in the source material itself. These details, the names, the dates, the specific functions, these are exactly the kinds of things that get tested in exams like the UPPCS mains. Knowing the difference is absolutely key. Next up, we've got the Charter Acts, and you can see a really clear progression here. The 1813 Act started chipping away at the company's trade monopoly, only leaving them with tea and the China trade. Then, 20 years later, the 1833 Act ended the monopoly completely and created the Governor General of India. And finally, the 1853 Act introduced the idea of a separate legislature and, this is crucial, an open civil service exam. You can see the story unfolding, from a simple trading company to a full-blown governing body.
And then, the Great Revolt of 1857. This was an absolute game changer. After this, the British government decided that company rule was over. Period. The Crown took direct control of India, and that kicked off a completely new legislative era. So here's our new roadmap. This period shows a series of acts that slowly and, let's be honest, often reluctantly, started to introduce more Indian involvement in how things were run. This is the path that leads us straight to the framework of modern India. The 1858 Acts was basically a total system reboot. It just dissolved the East India Company, got rid of the old dual control system, all of it. All governing power was handed directly to the British Crown, who was represented in India by a viceroy, and the whole thing was overseen from London by a new Secretary of State for India. This is the official start of the British Raj. Okay, here's a term you absolutely positively have to know for your exams. Diarchy. It literally just means double rule. In the provinces, all the government subjects were split into 2 lists. Reserve subjects, the really powerful ones like finance and police, were kept under the direct control of the British governor. Meanwhile, transferred subjects, like education and health, were handed over to Indian ministers. These 3 acts are the real heavy hitters of this era. First, in 1909, the Morley-Minto reforms introduced the very controversial system of separate electorates for Muslims. 10 years later, the 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms brought in diarchy at the provincial level. And finally, the enormous Government in India Act of 1935, which basically served as a blueprint for our modern constitution and established huge institutions like the Reserve Bank of India. All right, theory is done. Now for the part I know you've been waiting for. Let's put all this knowledge into practice and see how you do with some actual questions from previous year's papers. You ready?
First question up, I want you to think back to those Charter Acts.
Which one of them ended the trade monopoly, except for tea and the China trade? The keyword you have to watch out for is except. The correct answer is A, the Charter Act of 1813. And remember why. The complete end of the monopoly came 20 years later in 1833. It's a subtle difference, but it's a classic exam trap. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Now here comes a tricky one. We talked all about diarchy, but this question is specifically asking where it was introduced at the central level, so be careful not to mix it up with the provincial level. Did you get it? The answer is C, the Government of India Act 1935. See, while the 1919 Act brought diarchy to the provinces, it was the 1935 Act that proposed it for the center. That is a super important distinction. Okay, let's hit our final question. This question is about a concept that had just profound consequences for Indian history: communal representation. So which act was the first to introduce that principle of separate electorates? That's it. The answer is B, the Minto-Morley Reforms of 1909. This is such a vital topic because the introduction of separate electorates for Muslims was a major event, one that many historians say directly led to the eventual partition of India. And just like that, our rapid revision is complete. I'm going to leave you with one final thought to chew on. Out of all these acts, which one do you think truly had the most lasting impact on modern India? Was it the 1858 Act that kicked off the Raj? Or maybe the 1935 Act that became the blueprint for our Constitution? Developing your own analysis on questions like this is what will set you apart in the main exams. Thanks for joining this explainer. Keep up the amazing work, and we'll see you in the next one.